Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be talking about the Stronger Standards Better Aged Care program. My name is Janet Anderson and I'm the Commissioner of the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. I'll be chairing today's event. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting right the way around Australia, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us for today's event. Today, as I said, you're going to be hearing about the strengthened aged care quality standards and how we at the Commission will be supporting the rollout of those standards, which are due to commence in July 2020. Now, as all of you would know, strengthening the quality standards was a key recommendation of the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety, and it was identified as being instrumental to improving the quality and safety of care and driving a better aged care experience for older Australians. So in response to that recommendation, successive governments have been determined on revising or strengthening the quality standards. So the Department of Health and Aged Care, as the lead on this, undertook a very extensive consultation process and has produced a draft revised set of quality standards. Now, we at the Commission see these strengthened quality standards as being an opportunity to boost the trust and confidence that older Australians and their families have in aged care, because it signals really clearly that the sector is serious about delivering high quality, safe care and being held to account for its performance. The strengthened standards are also valuable in providing us at the Commission with an opportunity to review and improve our regulatory approach as we continue to work towards being a best practice regulator. So the program we have developed to support you in the sector and ourselves to fully harness all the opportunities presented by the strengthened standards is one we've called Stronger Standards, Better Aged Care. And you'll hear that talked about across the course of this webinar. Put simply, the aim of the program is to make sure that we're all ready for the changes to come, older Australians, providers, and the Commission. And that means helping you, the providers, to prepare for the introduction of the strengthened standards, ensuring that older Australians know what they can expect for their care experience, and indeed what to expect from us as the regulator, and ensuring that the Commission is ready to apply the new standards and work with providers to lift quality and safety across the sector. Now, there's a lot of content to get through today, so I'll just briefly outline what we can expect to cover. We'll be discussing the standards in the context of the proposed new regulatory framework. We'll be talking about what is changing between the existing quality standards and those which are proposed for introduction in July 24. And we'll also be talking about how we in the Commission can support the sector to understand what needs to be done and to take the necessary action to ensure that you remain fit for purpose and can not just comply, but excel under the strengthened standards. Joining me today on the panel, I have a range of experts, starting with people from the Commission, Lisa Peterson, who's the Assistant Commissioner Sector Capability, and Emma Jobson, the Executive Director, Regulatory Policy and Intelligence. But also we're joined, and I'm delighted to say we have with us Tim Humphries, the Chief Executive Officer of Homestyle Aged Care Services, and Jane Pappen, Managing Director of Pop-Up Health. And also on the panel is Josh Malden from the Department of Health and Aged Care, the Assistant Secretary Choice and Transparency Branch. So a veritable feast of experts to assist us through this really important subject. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get fully underway. You can submit questions at any time. Just click on the blue raised hand icon towards the top of your screen. And we will be sharing the slides from today's session for everyone who registered to attend. Now, if you want to ensure that you can read the slides, you can actually make them full screen I am reliably informed, by hovering your cursor over the slides. You'll see a square icon in the top right-hand corner. If you click on that, the slides will increase in size. Click on it again to return to the combined slides and camera view. We also have a short survey for you to complete so you can give us your feedback on the webinar, and we always read it closely and learn from it. You'll be taken to the webinar automatically at the end, survey at the end of the webinar. But if you want to complete it before then, you can find it by clicking on the yellow speech bubble icon on your screen. And now, after all of that, I'm very pleased to invite Lisa to give her presentation to kick things off. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Janet, and hi everybody. I'm really delighted to be here today and to have the opportunity to talk to you about the implementation of the strengthened aged care quality standards. I'm coming to you from the beautiful lands of the Darug people, and I'd like to pay my respects to the First Nations peoples on all the different lands on which we meet today, and pay my respects to elders past and present and those who are joining us for the conversation this afternoon. So in this session, I'm going to give you a very quick overview of how the standards will apply to different service types in the new regulatory model that's coming from 1 July of next year. I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining how the standards are changing, and we'll also talk about what the Commission's doing to support the sector to be ready for change. As Janet said, there'll be plenty of opportunities to answer your questions, so please start putting those in as you think of things to ask us. And we're also keen to hear from you on what we can do to best support the sector through the change. So let me start with the proposed new regulatory model for aged care. This new model will place older people in Australia at the front and centre of regulation. It increases protections for older people and empowers them to exercise their rights. And at the same time, better supports continuous improvement in the sector. And the aged care quality standards are changing, and the standards are being strengthened as part of this new proposed regulatory model. So the Department of Health and Aged Care is responsible for the regulatory model or framework, and they'll provide advice to government which will inform the final version of the strengthened standards. But to get the full picture on what the strengthened standards mean for you, there are some elements of this new reg model that are important to be across. Now, I'm hoping that everyone might have had a chance to have a look at the current consultation paper on the new model. And this paper is really, right now, your best reference point on the changes that are coming. But let me give you a very quick recap on things that are important for our discussion this afternoon. So the paper explains how the draft strengthened standards are expected to apply, and also talks about the current thinking on the reform journey ahead. And the paper proposes that we'll be moving from our current system of provider approvals to a new registration model. And at this stage, there are 6 different registration categories based on service types, which I'm hoping you can see on the slide. And to understand how the new regulatory model will impact you, it's really important to be across those proposed registration categories. I'm not going to go into detail on this today, but I do encourage you, if you haven't already had a look to understand where your service or services might fit, please do. And this is important because how the strengthened standards will apply to you will depend on your service category. So, as you know, the current standards are a one-size-fits-all model, so all standards apply to all approved providers, and we know that this has been a real pain point, particularly for home and community care. The new regulatory model proposes that there'll be flexible application of the strengthened standards across the different service categories. And the diagram on the slide, we've lifted this from the department's consultation paper. We've tried to make it a bit easier to read on the slide, but it's still a busy. So again, the paper is the place to go to have a closer look. But the diagram shows you that the standards are just one element in the regulatory architecture for aged care, and there are also other regulatory obligations, as is the case now. So what's being proposed for the future is a mix of provider obligations that will apply to everyone, obligations that are specific to a service category, and the standards will apply differently depending on your service category. So, for example, if you're providing residential aged care, all 7 standards will apply to you. If you're delivering clinical care in the home, standards 1 to 5 would apply to you. And if you're providing social support, you're not subject to the standard, but you are, of course, subject to other provider obligations. So once again, I can't tout this paper enough. It's really worth having a look at if you haven't had the chance already, and that will help you be clear about how the new regulatory model applies to your particular service. Now, the role of the Commission is to implement the strengthened standards and to help the sector prepare for the change. And the go-live date, we understand, for the strengthened standards is 1 July 2024. So we have a year. And that might feel like a long time, but there is a lot to do to get ready. And one of the key pieces of feedback we've heard from the implementation of the current standards in 2019 is that people didn't feel ready for the change. And we hope to do better this time around. Now, one of the challenges, I think, for all of us is that the standards won't be final until we have the new Aged Care Act and the subordinate legislation. And we're hopeful that this will happen well ahead of 1 July, but it relies on government passing legislation. So the timing is very much subject to parliamentary processes. And we know that collectively we need a good long runway to get ready for this change, and we can't wait for everything final to start the work. So we're actively working now to anticipate the scope and the scale of the change. And what I'm sharing with you today is the information that's currently available to us. So that's the draft standards in their current form. And part of the work program ahead is testing those draft standards, and I'll say a bit more about that shortly. But I do need to make the point that nothing that I tell you today is absolutely definitive, and we might have to adapt further. But I want to show you how the standards are being strengthened and the changes that we believe will support the sector to deliver a better experience of aged care for older Australians. So firstly, we're moving from the current framework of 8 standards with 42 requirements to 7 standards and 152 actions. Now, there's been a shift in the language, so what we call organisational requirements for the current standards are actions under the new standards. And what I want to show you today is the framework that we've developed together with the department to explain the changes. So we've approached this by looking at the actions that sit under each of the 7 strengthened standards. And our framework for explaining the change has 4 elements. Element 1, so this identifies where existing requirements are retained in the actions in a way that's unchanged. Element 2, so this is where we've brought some of the obligations that currently sit somewhere else in the regulatory framework into the strengthened standards. Element 3 is where the strengthened standards clarify or add detail to the content of the current standards. And element 4 is where we're introducing actions that are new or enhanced. So this table shows you how we've mapped each of the 152 actions in the strengthened standards against that framework. And a reminder that this is based on the draft standards in their current form. So if the standards change further, then we'll update our analysis. And I do need to say this is not an exact science. It is a judgment call, and I think we'd be very interested to hear if there are points where you see it differently. We have today published a document on our website that unpacks the information that you see on the table and shows how each of the 152 actions fits into our framework for understanding the change. And we'll send that around to everybody after the webinar. But I'm going to focus now on where actions are changing and show you some examples of what that looks like. So in drafting the strengthened standards, several provider obligations that already exist in other instruments, so things like the Quality Care Principles, the Code of Conduct and the Charter of Aged Care Rights, elements of that have now been incorporated into the standards. And while these are core requirements that providers must already comply with, I think the critical change here is that the Commission will be actively regulating compliance on a regular basis as part of our assessment against the strengthened standards. These examples on this slide go to where we've added content to current requirements to make them clearer. So we've added detail and we've made more explicit concepts that are implied but not necessarily clearly spelt out in the current standards. And unsurprisingly, this accounts for the largest share of the changes. So these clarifications very much draw on, and in fact all of the changes draw on the very extensive public consultation process that the department ran over the last year or so. And so they reflect your experience of implementation, but also our ability to assess the current standards consistently and have that common understanding with you. And the intention of the improvements in clarity is really to provide greater transparency of expectations for both providers and older Australians. And these changes will also support consistent understanding and assessment by both the regulator and the sector. And now category 4, so where we're seeing actions that are new or enhanced. So the Royal Commission recommended a specific focus on additional requirements in 5 different areas for the standards. So they were diversity, dementia care, clinical care, provider governance and food and nutrition. And you'll see that many of the new concepts within the strengthened standards are aligned to those focus areas. And we've also captured here where we see that an existing requirement has been enhanced. Now, food is a great example. In the current standards, all we say about food under Standard 4 is where meals are provided, they're varied and of suitable quality and quantity. Under new Standard 6, which is our new dedicated food standards, among other things, we now talk about ensuring that food and drink and the dining experience are enjoyable. And that's an enhancement and a very deliberate lift in expectations. So what does this all mean for you? Well, we think that the impact of the change from the strengthened standards will very much be determined by the maturity of the provider. So for those of you that are already delivering great person-centred care, where older Australians are partners in the design of their care, with diversity actively considered and respected, where you've got strong corporate and clinical governance, we're not expecting to see significant shifts. Of course, there are always opportunities for all of us to improve what we do. But for providers who are less advanced in their practice, we really do see strong benefits in the strengthened standards, providing a much clearer articulation of what's expected. And we think that will help guide providers in lifting performance to deliver the care that older Australians need and expect. Now, we know that it's really important to have the right guidance and resources and training both for the sector and our own staff so that we all have a consistent understanding around the intent of the standards, how we expect them to be implemented and how we're going to assess performance. Now, as Janet has said, the job of the Commission, of course, is to regulate the strengthened standards and to manage that implementation. And we know that this is a very significant change for the sector. And Janet referenced the program of work that we have underway to support that change, which we call Stronger Standards, Better Aged Care. And we have a vision for where this program of work will take us. So this is where we want to be on that magical day when we make the switch to the strengthened standards. And as you heard from Janet, at its simplest level, we want everyone to be ready. So older Australians, providers and the Commission. So for older Australians, we want to make sure that they know what to expect from their care experience and what they can expect from us at the Commission if that experience doesn't meet expectations. For providers, we want you to be absolutely clear about your regulatory obligations, to understand what might need to be different from your current practice. And we want to be crystal clear with you and very transparent about how we're going to assess performance against the standards, both our process and how performance will be evidenced. And we want you to have the tools that you need to assess your own performance in the same way that we will, so that you can drive continuous improvement. Now, this slide shows you the trajectory of our program of work, and there's a couple of things to point out on this slide. We are really in the very early stages of this program. So where we're at is designing and testing a new audit method through our pilot. So we still have a really long way to go. The point of the pilot is to test how the draft strengthened standards and the redesigned audit or assessment approach is going to apply in practice. And our pilot involves a sample of around 40 providers, and we put a call out to the sector for volunteers and we got a great response, so thank you for that. We've selected providers and sites for the pilot to be representative of the sector, so we're giving consideration to the service type, the size of the service, the entity type, the location, and of course the needs of the people receiving care. And the initial pilot audits that happened in April, they focused on new standard 5, which is our clinical standard. And that work is informing the approach we're taking to the remaining audits, which we're doing against the complete set of standards, including further work on standard 5. And if all of that goes according to plan, we're hoping that our pilot audits across the standards will be finished around the end of August or early September. And when we get there, our next task will be to evaluate and present what we learned through the pilot back to the department, but also importantly, back to the sector, back to you. And the outcomes of that pilot process will inform the final design of our audit methodology and the final version of the standards. And you'll see that our program doesn't stop after go live. We're going to do our best, but we know that we won't score a perfect landing for 1 July. And we want to be really clear with you that we're going to have a process for reflecting on how well things are working for you and for us, and we'll adapt where we need to in a cycle of continuous improvement. And we're working closely with providers to develop the right tools and resources to support you through the change. We have a customer experience project underway at the moment to help us to understand what it's like for you and for older Australians to engage with us across our different regulatory functions, such as making a complaint or going through an audit process or being part of a compliance action. And that project will help us to identify where there might be pain points and opportunities for improvement. And we really believe that if we provide a quality customer experience, we can improve our regulatory impact and trust and confidence in the work that we do. And the project that we have includes talking to providers and older Australians about preferences for information channels and how we can design education resources and tools that are easy to use and deliver practical learning outcomes. At our very recent national conference, I shared our early thinking on our evidence framework for assessing performance against the standard. And through our pilot program, we're testing the most appropriate source of evidence for each of those 152 actions. And we anticipate that what we'll find is that for some actions, there might be multiple evidence types, and there might also be differences in the sorts of evidence we expect to see across different service categories. So when we land that piece of work, our next step will be to develop a tool for the sector that maps the evidence category and the evidence type for each of the actions under the strengthened standards. And our goal here will be to provide you with complete transparency around how we expect our audit teams to approach the assessment of each action. And that's just one example of the resources we'll be developing to support the change. We'll be engaging both older Australians and providers in the development of our change support and education products. And this is something that we started doing here at the Commission about 9 months ago, so building testing of our products into our regular development cycle. But we've got to amp those arrangements in a big way, given the amount of content that we'll be developing. So if you're interested in being part of that process, we would love to hear from you. You can contact us at aged care reform, all one word, at agecarequality, all one word, .gov.au, and we'd love to hear from you. Now, also at our conference, I took the opportunity to ask providers what the Commission should be doing to best support the sector through the change. And this slide shows you what providers told us. This is a word cloud, so the larger the font, the more popular the idea. And we'd love to ask you for your ideas, so please also put those into the chat. We also, on this next slide, you'll see that we also ask providers what they think they need to do to prepare for the strengthened standards. And again, that's a really useful insight for us because it helps us to understand where we can best focus our support. Now, that's the end of what I wanted to share with you today. We will continue to share our progress as we move through our program. You'll find loads of content on our website. We'll continue to speak to you through webinars and other engagements with the sector, and you'll be able to find content through our quality bulletin and also on social media. So please keep an eye out. But we're absolutely thrilled to have today with us two aged care leaders who have very kindly agreed to share with us their thinking on how to best prepare for the strengthened standards. So Tim, if we can start with you, please, Tim Humphries. What's going to be important to you in preparing your organisation for the implementation of the strengthened standards?
Thanks, Lisa. Look, I think the one thing for me, and perhaps many of you on the call today, excuse me, 2019 doesn't feel like it was that long ago, so it's still fresh in our minds as to how we tackled the change in standards back then. And I think the thing that we did quite well at that point was to just try and keep up to date with the information that was coming through. And by that I mean broadly understanding the entire change, but focusing only on the things that have been finalised. And as Lisa said, a lot of this stuff will change and move over the next months and possibly year, but we deliberately focused on those things that have been deemed finalised. So actually putting effort and energy into that, and then waiting for further details to be finalised in other areas. And I think one of the things that I think it's important for all of us, including the Commission, to just have firmly in the back of our mind is how each of these changes lead to better care for the residents that we're looking after. So I think that's a good thing, and perhaps, Lisa, if you're comfortable, we should be able to push back on that a little if we can see some changes coming through that might not lead to better care and have some unintended consequences, that we can have some two-way conversations to ensure that we're actually achieving the desired outcome, which of course is safer and better care.
Thanks very much, Tim. I think you make some really good points there. And one of the challenges for, one of the things that we're thinking about is how we can, things will become, some things won't be certain until, we have the legislation, but there'll be other things. For example, understanding for us what might be, where most of the changes might lie, and what advice we can provide to the sector about that. So we'll be feeding information on things that we know as soon as we can share it, and I think that will be an important part of the process for us. Tim, just on that, can you, you've already mentioned to us about the importance of understanding how the changes would lead to better care for residents and being able to have a conversation about that. What can the Commission be doing in your view to best support the sector through the change process?
Look, I think one of the things that's pretty important is to explain the process, the parliamentary process, which I think kind of touched on. And I think you and I had a conversation a while ago, Lisa, where you explained that the timing is the timing and you don't get to choose that. An Act of Parliament does. So just having that understanding, as you touched on, that if 1 July is the go-live date, or 1 July is the go-live date, and we're all probably going to be working beyond that because things won't be finalised in completeness at that point. Look, the other thing, and this is, I'm going to contradict myself now, but trying to minimise the amount of changes. Again, I remember from the last standard implementation, there were a number of changes that were introduced in late June that then got changed in early July.
Right.
And that just created work for us that perhaps, maybe if it's not finalised, perhaps if there's a way you can do it within the requirements of the Act to push it into July, that might be helpful, rather than having a couple of different versions that require changes in procedures our end. And I think, as you touched on, Lisa, I think that the template that you've talked about is pretty handy by just sort of really clearly explaining, here are the things that are going to stay the same. And look, we might need to take a mapping exercise to make sure that our procedures line up with whatever changes in the way that's presented work. And then obviously there's a few regulatory requirements that will come through in new standards, just understanding that again to see if we need to change procedures. So, the rewrite last time was a complete rewrite. It kind of feels like this time, hopefully it's going to be sort of maybe a 50% rewrite and a 25% tweak and then 25% of new content. So I think just having that clearly articulated, which I think you've really touched on today, Lisa, and I know you did in your presentation a couple of weeks ago, is pretty important. And look, the one thing that I think is still really clear, the new standards and the models that are in your consultation paper have the residents still firmly at the centre.
Yes.
The 7 standards. So to me, it kind of looks and smells quite similar. So we're using some language that the Royal Commission's foisted upon us to make sure that we improve and, as Janet said, gain the trust of the community, which we all agree is important. But I think it smells to me like there's more similarities than there are differences, even though there's going to be a change in the way it's presented.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tim. I think that's an interesting comment, and we might ask Josh from the Department of Health to comment on that as part of our Q&A discussion. But you've made some really interesting observations there, Tim, and given us a few things to think about, so thank you. Jane, if we can turn to you now. Now, you're a home care provider. I'm interested in your thinking around getting ready for the standards and what that means for your organisation.
Pop-up Health, we're looking at currently strengthening our board education in terms of their aged care knowledge and questioning that they need to be questioning us. We're also initiating some increased consumer representation on a lot of our committees. And I think we're looking overall at the incident management processes that we have to try and line them up with the new strengthened standards. We're also doing, I think for home care providers, we're all looking at increasing the education for those staff, the care staff, and those who are looking at, who are managing the aged care clients that we have. So yeah, I think we're strengthening a lot of our in-house training. And working a lot with our board and our clinical governance committee.
Thanks, Jane, and I think you make some really excellent points there. I was particularly interested in your comment about board education. I mean, we would very, very much agree that it's important that the change is understood and driven from the top. So that's a really interesting observation. And also your other point that very much resonated with me is around making sure that the workforce and that the people that are delivering care on the ground really understand what it means for them and the way that they look after the people that they care for. Mm-hmm. Jane, can I ask you to also tell us what would you like to see from the Commission to help you to prepare for the change?
Thanks, Lisa. I think just reinforcing the education that we're doing for the board, I think some really plain English communication and information and just some guidelines for our board members and our leadership team, just on what are the strengthened standards, how will our organisation's performance be assessed against them, and what the board should do to get ready for those strengthened standards. I think making sure that there's development of, if the Commission could develop some really easy to understand and useful, relevant tools for use to implement the standards, the strengthened standards, and that could apply to across the board from consumer through to our care staff, through to our leadership team. One of the important things that I think is an avenue for our staff to be able to contact the Commission to just ask a simple question and to seek clarification on any aspect of that we may experience when we're dealing with our consumers or within the processes of the strengthened standards and how that is rolled out. It'd be great to have a team that we could, ask those questions.
Great, thank you, Jane. There were some really interesting points there, and I think I'm again with your suggestions about strengthening board education. Of course, our Governing for Reform program, which I hope that people are aware of, is a free program for governing body members and executive to really assist in building both corporate and clinical governance for aged care providers. We'll certainly be looking at how through that program we make sure that we've got some really suitable education tools, and I think we would be wanting to make those broadly available to everybody in the sector, regardless of whether they were participating in the program or not. But I should give the program a plug and tell you that still open. I think we've got about 5,000 aged care leaders who are currently participating, but always welcome more. And I'm also interested in what you had to say about role-based communication and education products, so things that are specifically targeting either older Australians or care staff or leadership. And this is certainly a direction that we've been thinking about and putting into practice. I guess we probably kicked that off in a big way with the work that we did around the reforms that came into place on 1 December of last year, but we certainly are ambitious to do lots more of that. So look, thank you both. I think you both raised some really interesting points and useful insights for us all to think about. And at this point, I'm going to hand back to Janet.
Wonderful, Lisa. Thank you. And thanks also to Tim and Jane. Keep your questions coming in, people. You know where to send them, as it were, and very happy to take as many as you would like to submit and deal with them if we can within the webinar, or if not, certainly on our website subsequently. I have so many avenues to explore as a result of the content we just received. I think I'm going to start with you, Josh. There has been, Lisa put up a slide which showed the runway between now and beyond the 1st of July 2024 starting date. Could you spend a little bit of time talking to us about where we are now? And I know the department's just published the latest version, the draft strengthened standards. But here we are, heading towards the end of June 2023. So there's a year to run before there's an expectation that these new standards will come into force. But there's a fair bit to do by the government and by Parliament. Can you just step us through that so that everyone watching has some sense of that trajectory, please?
Absolutely, Janet, happy to. And look, I've picked that, that question up in a number of, forums, is that, when will the strengthened standards go live, so that we have time to prepare and embed the change in our organisation. So I'll lay the question in that vein. And I just want to reiterate a few things that were said by Tim insofar as the role of government, and that is government has high aspirations for the reform of the aged care sector. Its timeframes are unapologetically ambitious for all of us as system actors, as we're all working really hard to implement the will of government and ultimately those legislative decisions that are made by Parliament. So the strengthened standards, while subject to confirmation by government, at this stage our advice is that they will go live at the same time as the new Aged Care Act. So Janet, as you said, which is currently proposed to commence on 1 July 2024. So from the sector perspective, the time to prepare starts now. Also channeling one thing that Tim said, which is right, because I think it rings true for both the Commission, the department, as well as providers, is that we only all went through this process 3 years ago, so we understand the implications on us. Sorry, I'll just turn the slide back on. Look, nothing in aged care is static. It continues to evolve, and so this is the same for standards. Following the comprehensive consultation process, which we commenced last year, industry, the Commission, we've had significant exposure to what the standards are looking like and how they're changing. So the structure's been changed to better align with disability. That's something that we heard from the sector really loud and clear. It's got clear consumer-facing outcomes, organisational outcomes and actions, and they're more detailed, they're specific and measurable. And again, that's something that we've heard from providers, that they want greater clarity on the expectation, which is where we've landed with those 152 actions. And how we develop those standards, we develop those by asking providers, experts and older people what good looks like. And those are the practices that have been reflected in the actions. And this is what providers to varying degrees are already doing. So we've published, currently what the standards look like, noting that these are subject to pilot and we will take the feedback from the Commission and providers during the pilot into account. But certainly get online and have a look at those standards now. Please get familiar with them now. We don't expect them to change significantly in content. I expect they will be nuanced. We will take feedback. So, for example, Tim said, if things aren't operating as intended, in terms of the policy intent on the ground, that's something we will consider through this process. So the mapping document that the Commission's produced is a really good starting point to show you what is new versus what are the areas that are clarifying existing requirements. And this is, Tim, this is where I also agree with you and your sense of smell, that a lot of it is actually leveraging the significant change in the standards that we saw in 2019. We've seen a reordering that to structurally align with disability. We've used words. Some of those words have come out of the Royal Commission. Some of those words have come from older people. It's the language that resonates with them. We've tried to reduce duplication and clarify things. And again, there's more actions so providers can better understand them. So where to now? The Commission will continue to go through that pilot. And we're working really closely, both the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission and with the Australian Health and Safety Commission, who are developing the clinical standards. And then what we'll do is, following the findings of that pilot, is we will look to communicate out with you again. So around August, September, October, we'll let you know what we learned, what we saw, and then keep you in the loop as we move through the legislation process. So this will travel as a piece of subordinate legislation. So it will go along with the Aged Care Act. It will hopefully accompany it as an exposure draft. And we will continue to show you what those standards look like, so you have absolute transparency. Will things change? And Tim, this is picking up on your comments before that, changes towards the really end of things weren't helpful. Ultimately, these things are a decision for, ministers and Parliament. And whilst we'll do our best to keep you apprised of those things, we will take you along the journey as best we can through this to ensure that there's full transparency in the lead up to the implementation. Thanks, Janet.
Oh, wonderful, Josh. And I know there's a bit of dissonance here. In some ways, there's not nearly enough time, but in other ways, there is lots of time. We have the year. Let's make best use of that entire 12 months. I think it's great in many ways that we're talking to you in June of the prior year. So we do have enough time to make this work. I know from here looking forward, it looks a bit intimidating, but as Tim and others have observed, the biggest lift arguably was in July 2019. And this is taking us another step along that journey, but it's not the same step change as we had in that experience. And I think we can learn and grow from that and be even better and more confident in making this next sequence of changes. But that leads me to a whole raft of other questions. And Emma, I'm going to ask one of you. A number of questions have come in around the application of the new standards to home services compared with their application to residential care services. Now, Lisa, in that architecture that she put up, which is drawn from the new regulatory model, did indicate that the standards as a total set do not apply to all categories of registered providers. But could you just talk to that higher level question? Does it work as well for home services?
Look, the draft strength and standards have been developed to be applied across the diversity of aged care settings. So this is really clearly articulated in the draft standard for the environment, where there are separate outcomes and actions actually built into the draft standard for environment around equipment at home versus in a residential service environment. So this has been something that is very much part of the design process. The pilot is designed to test how the draft standards will apply in practice across home and residential settings. The audits that have commenced in residential care are being rolled out to include all relevant aged care settings, such as care in the home, of course, residential care, rural remote settings, and different home care programs, including CHSP. The findings from the pilot are intended to inform any adjustments in the application of the standards in home care and other settings like remote service delivery. So they will also inform, as Lisa's outlined, our guidance, resources and information for providers and consumers. The outcomes of the pilots are informing and being shared with the department, will be considered as Lisa outlined earlier with regard to the final set of standards, but also the pilot is very much around developing the methodologies which would incorporate any adjustments.
So Emma, let me stay with that final comment. Talk to us a bit more about the methodology.
The method that we're piloting has some key changes. I think is a good way to understand that compared to the current state. One of the 3 key changes is the introduction of grading of assessment outcomes. So we're moving from the binary pass, fail, not met, compliant, not compliant against the standards to a graded assessment model. So this means that the outcome, the assessment against each outcome would be conformance, minor non-conformance or major non-conformance. And we're also testing the identification of examples of best practice as part of that audit process. There's also, as Lisa described, a second key change around the use of an evidence framework to support the graded assessment process. So this introduces categories for the different sources of evidence. The categories include older people's experience, feedback from workers and management, feedback from third parties like other health professionals or anyone engaged in delivery of care and services to older people in the service, on-site observations, processes used by the provider and services, of course, to deliver care, and outcomes for consumers. So these are all familiar to providers as they are mostly sources of evidence that we currently use. The evidence collection framework is just about making this more transparent and easier for everyone to understand. There's also a third key area where we are testing as part of the pilots, which is how we organise the audit process. So this includes how we incorporate all information that we may already hold about providers, so including what you providers would have already reported to the department and the commission. Opportunities to audit providers rather than only their services against the standards. For example, we're looking at what we can ask for once from providers on how you govern and manage all your services. We're also includes collecting evidence in stages, such as from providers and then later at services and sites, as well as how we might use on and off-site approaches to evidence collection. There's also a range of other enhancements we're working on, which we thought it's important to mention. This includes using a digital audit tool with potentially both commission and provider access as part of that evidence collection and decision-making process. Enhancing the role of providers in sharing the outcomes of their audits with their consumers and representatives, as well as improving how we, the commission, share audit outcomes with providers and consumers ourselves. We're retaining the process where providers can review and provide further responses on preliminary audit findings, which is currently called the assessment report, before a decision is finalised. And of course, we're preparing education resources for the sector, but also training for our own staff to ensure everyone is ready and aligned in our understanding of the new standards for implementation in July next year.
Wow, a very comprehensive answer. I suspect that answer alone will send some people to the recording to listen to it again. Emma, just a follow-up question on that. There's a lot of content there. Are we going to be producing guidance for providers, and guidance which is more specifically for residential care providers and home services providers, so that it can be as specific and helpful as possible?
Yes, our intention is to be producing guidance on how we will be interpreting the standards and specifically for providers, both of residential and home care. Okay.
All right, I have a couple of questions that I'll deal with. Natalie's asked about the 1 July 2024 commencement date and whether there's a grace period or some leniency. as Josh was outlining, and I think Lisa may have also referred to it, the starting date for the new legislation is effectively the starting date for the application of the strengthened standards. And so as the regulator of performance against those standards, we don't have discretionary power as to whether or not we assess services against the new standards at a particular point in time. The date on which they come into place is the date from which we will be regulating the sector against those standards. So at the moment, that's planned for 1 July 2024. But I will say that we have a lot of work to do leading into July 2024, and we've talked about some of the resources that we are going to provide for that. But we're also very keen to ensure that we have the right transition arrangements in place for those services who are engaged with us and are partway through a process. Now, we had to have these transition arrangements in place when we commenced the new standards in July 2019, and some of you would recall that you may have applied for a reaccreditation audit, and it had been confirmed that it would happen in the next period, and you were expecting that there would be that audit taking place, but it hadn't yet happened. And then we had the switch over to 1 July, and you wanted and deserved clarity about which standards you would be audited against. So I'm going to ask, now I'm not sure whether it's Lisa or Emma, but I'll start with Lisa. Lisa, I think you can provide an ironclad assurance that we will be looking closely and communicating clearly about those transition arrangements where we are partway engaged with a service, whether it's resolving a complaint or undertaking an assessment of performance.
Yes, 100%, Janet. Thank you. So we're in the process of thinking through how those arrangements might best work, but there will be some very clear communication to not just to everybody more broadly, but also those who might have something underway on the date that we switch. So we'll be making sure that we are very thorough in our communication so people really understand what to expect. The details of what that might look like, we're still working through, but we'll be sharing those with the sector well in advance of the time.
Okay, I'm going to stay with you. Jennifer's come through with a question about practical tips for small organisations to prepare themselves. Yeah. She makes the really valid point that larger organisations typically, not universally, but typically have access to more resources who can be taken offline or be dedicated to this preparatory work. But smaller organisations with fewer staff and having to spread themselves across a broader range of functions have less latitude in that regard. And we in the Commission are really acutely aware of this. So can you just speak to how you will assist smaller organisations particularly?
Yeah, thanks very much, Janet, and thank you, Jennifer. It's a really great question, and I think we very much understand that we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach to how we support the sector through the change, and we're well aware that we will need to have some very targeted engagement and perhaps different forms of support for different providers across the sector. So, for example, small independent services, we're thinking about how we can best assist you. We're thinking about First Nations and coal providers and so on. But Jennifer, one of the things that we're really keen to do is actually hear from you about what might be most useful. So part of the arrangements that we're working through at the moment with our customer experience project is trying to get some of that feedback from the sector, but we're keen to do that more broadly. So we're thinking through at the moment how we can best set up a sort of an informal group of providers that we can talk with and hear from you directly about what sort of change and education products are going to be of most use to you. So we'd love people to get involved. So stand by to hear more about that. But in the meanwhile, if there are people out there that would like to be a part of that process, as I said earlier, we would very much love to hear from you. So please contact us at aged care reform, or one word, at agecarequality, or one word, .gov.au. Thanks, Janet.
All right, another one for you, Lisa. Consumers are at the centre of frame.
Yep.
And it's equally important that they understand what these changes mean and what they have a right to expect, the conversations they would then have with providers. And I know that we are looking to communicate directly with consumers and get the word out and work via the peak representative bodies and undertake a range of different communication strategies to ensure that as many people as possible get to understand the strength standards. But we're also looking for providers to assist in that endeavour, aren't we? That there are privileged spaces that only aged care workers have in their interactions with those receiving aged care, where they can talk about the strength and standards. And I just wondered if you wanted to reinforce that expectation that we're looking for providers also to engage directly with the people receiving their care and to have conversations about the strength and standards.
Yeah, very much so, Janet, and thank you. That's a really important point for us to touch on. I mean, as Janet says, we at the Commission are very aware that we don't have the direct line to people who are receiving aged care. The proportion of people who are receiving aged care or caring for someone receiving an aged care service that deal with us is, that's only a subset of that broader population. So we do think it will be very important. And one of the things that we're thinking about in terms of our communication and change support program is what could we develop that would help you to have those conversations. So we're very mindful in how we do this, in thinking about the diversity of our whole community and thinking about how we can prepare information in a way that considers people who may have literacy challenges, may be vision or hearing impaired, may have cognitive challenges, may not engage easily with the written word. So we absolutely see that you have a very important role to play here in having these conversations with your the people that you care for, particularly about what it means in the context of the service that they receive from you and their experience of care. But we want to do our bit to support those conversations. And again, we'll be really interested to hear from you about what you think would be most useful to support you in having those conversations.
All right. So, Tim and Jane, you've had front row seats in this webinar and have been generous enough to share with us some of your early thinking about the preparation journey that each of you and your organisations is going to go on. Just very briefly, in a couple of words, are you willing to accompany us on this journey? How confident are you that we're going to get there together? Tim first.
Well, I'm not sure we have a choice, Janet. So we're on the tram. I'm from Melbourne. But look, I think we just have to, I think we all appreciate and understand that the Royal Commission's driven a lot of change, and we're on that journey of making change with the hope of making the sector more trusted by the community more broadly. I think that's the ultimate aim of all of these changes. So I just hope that the changes lead to that outcome.
Absolutely. We certainly have that in our sights. Thank you. And Jane?
But I also think for home care providers, there will be lots of challenges along the way. But I also think the olive branch from the Commission with their conference recently, and I think an openness for communication is just going to be the way to make it a successful transition.
Oh, well said. Thank you for those summary comments. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. My deep thanks to panellists, Lisa and Emma from the Commission, Josh from the department, and of course Tim and Jane from aged care providers. Really appreciated all your contributions. I think we all know that the strengthened standards have as their ambition to improve the care, the safety, well-being and the quality of life of older Australians, and that's worth working on. And what's hopefully been clear for today, and Jane nicely reinforced it, was the commitment that the Commission and the Department have to support the sector in implementing the strengthened quality standards, to understand what's required and to do the necessary work, make the necessary changes in your services. Just a quick reminder that there is a feedback survey that you'll be taken to at the end of the webinar. If you've not already completed it, please do so. We genuinely want to hear from you so that we can continue improving our products, as it were. Thank you to everyone who sent in questions. Any we didn't get to, we will publish responses on our website, and you know the address. I won't repeat it here. There will be a video recording of this webinar available, so if you want to watch it again or recommend it to peers, please do. And finally, an ad for coming attractions. Tuesday, the 18th of July is the date for our next sector webinar, and we'll be talking about compliance. So keep an eye out for an invitation to register for that webinar. Thank you, everyone, for your participation today. I hope it has met your needs, and we look forward to continue working with you on this really, really important enterprise. Take care, everyone.